Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Ayman Nazir and welcome to Knowledge Realm. Students, we have started a new course for our CSS preparation. We have started international relations and we have already studied the detailed definition of international relations, the elements of the subject, the scope of the subject, and the multidisciplinary nature of the subject. Today, students, we're going to discuss a very interesting topic. We're going to study about the birth of international relations and the evolution of international relations and the significance of this subject also. So stay focused and let's get started. Starting with a brief introduction, students, whatever we study in this subject in IR, it is not new. It is very, very old. We study relations among nations in IR. Relations among nations is not a new practice. It has existed since the existence of nations. For example, China and India. We all know that China is a very ancient nation. India is also a very ancient country, and China and India had relations in 16th century and 17th century also. Similarly, India and Ottoman Empire, these two empires also had relations in 16th century and 17th century. So this relations among nations is not a new practice. But ancient empires, civilizations, they also used to develop nations. So this is not new. Then wars also, we study war in IR. War is also not a new practice, and it has always been a part of relations among nations. For example, Greek-Sparta wars, Peloponnesian wars. In the book of Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides is talking about one of the dominant theories of IR that we study today. Thucydides is talking about realism. Realism has its roots in this book of Thucydides, the history of Peloponnesian War. So we can understand that the two dominant theories of IR, that is realism and liberalism, these two theories are also not new but ancient. These theories are ancient. Liberalism was also born in 17th century. Here I have attached a picture of John Locke. John Locke is a prominent scholar of liberalism. But IR as a subject did not exist at the time. All these things, whatever we study in this subject today, all these areas are ancient. But IR did not exist as a subject at the time. People used to practice all these things, but they never studied these practices in a separate subject. IR did not exist as a subject at the time. The studying of the relations in a separate subject is relatively new. So we can say that yes, IR is a young subject, but whatever we study in the subject, this is not new, this is old, this is ancient. But the subject is itself new. IR was born in 1919 and IR is evolving with each passing day because the nature of this subject is evolving. Okay, students, let's start with the birth of IR as a subject. When the subject was born and what were the events that led to the birth of IR? Student, it was the end of World War I. IR was born out of ashes of war. In 1918, World War I ended. More than 15 million people died in this war. Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. It was the peace treaty between the warring nations of the world at the time. And students, after the end of World War I, scholars started thinking the reasons that triggered such a deadly war. And they started thinking of a system that could prevent the triggering of this kind of war. They started thinking of a system that could promote peace among nations and that could prevent conflict among nations. So for this purpose, they started a new subject, that is international relations. Woodrow Wilson gave his 14 points at the time. Woodrow Wilson was also one of these scholars that wanted to promote peace among nations in the world, and then these scholars started IR, international relations, as a separate subject. David Davis was a Welsh Liberal politician. He donated £20,000 to the University College of Wales at Aberystwyth, and at University College of Wales, first professorship of IR was started. So students, what was the main goal of IR? The main goal of IR was to herald a new world that is free from the menace of war. Then London School of Economics opened the first department of IR, and the first university was the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies that was founded in 1927, and this university was dedicated to international relations. Now students, we know that international relations born as a subject after the end of World War I, because scholars wanted a system that could prevent conflict and war among nations. So, to prevent all this, a separate subject was started, that is international relations. So students, all this study reveals that the main goal of IR was the prevention of war in the world. This is how IR was born as a subject in 20th century after the end of World War I. I hope this is clear. Here students, I have designed a timeline, and this would make the memorization very easy, how this IR was born in the world. So let's start with the World War I. Students, we all know that in 1919 World War I ended. Then scholars tried to investigate the reasons of such a great war, because this war, World War I, was unprecedented in the history of the world. Then a new discipline was required to complete the task. A new discipline was required to investigate the reasons of such a deadly war and to prevent such war in future. David Davis, who was a Welsh politician, he donated £20,000 to the University College of Wales at Aberystwyth, and at this university, first professorship of IR was started. Then in 1920, in London School of Economics, first department of international relations was started, and then the first university was the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies was started. So this is how IR was born, and this was a very comprehensive and nice timeline of the procedure of the start of IR as a subject in the world. So students, we have studied the birth of international relations. Now we're going to study the evolution of the scope of IR. And students, before starting the evolution of scope of IR, I'd like to clear here that I would explain this evolution of scope of IR in the context of history, in the context of historical events. I would explain different historical events, and I would connect these historical events with the evolution of a scope of IR, and I would explain that how these events contributed in the evolution of a scope of IR. So starting with the evolution of a scope of IR in 20th century. Students, IR was introduced as a separate subject, and it was introduced to study the war actually. It was introduced to present a new system for the world that could prevent the initiation of war in the world and that could promote positive relations among nations in the world. So in 1920, a concept and approach was introduced. This concept was idealism. Students, idealism was a kind of system that was proposed to run the affairs of the world. It was designed to prevent the war and promote positive relations among nations, and in 1920 Woodrow Wilson gave his 14 points. Woodrow Wilson was one of the scholars who proposed this system, this approach, idealism. This is the reason it was called Wilsonianism also. So students, this approach was added to the scope of IR. It contributed to the evolution of scope of IR in 20th century. This approach proposes some policies that could promote positive relations among nations. It proposed relations among nations, positive relations among nations, trade among nations, and resolution of conflicts among nations through the international organizations such as League of Nations, and it proposed many things, and it was added to the scope of IR, and this is how it contributed to the evolution of the scope of IR. This was the first thing that was added to the scope of IR. Then student, after the end of World War I, League of Nations was formed as a result of Treaty of Versailles. League of Nations came into existence on January 10, 1920. It was the birth of international organizations. We all know that before this, international organization did not exist in the world. There were no international organizations. After World War I, for the first time, all the international leaders, global leaders, got together and they formed an international organization. Students, this was the beginning of non-state actors that we study today in international relations. So this birth of international relations expanded the scope of IR in 20th century. It contributed in the evolution of a scope of IR, because we all know that before this, non-state actors did not exist. The aim of the League of Nations was the prevalence of international peace and the elimination of threat of war, and scholars of IR started studying this international organizations, and this was the beginning of non-state actors. So this event once again contributed in the evolution of a scope of IR. It contributed in the expansion of a scope of IR. Then student, in 1929, we all know the worst economic crisis of 20th century came, the Great Depression of 1929. This economic crisis, students, created such a great impact that led to the birth of socialism and fascism. Fascism in Italy and fascism in Germany. In Italy, it was the fascism of Benito Mussolini, and in Germany, it was the fascism of Adolf Hitler. It was the impact of this Great Depression of 1929 that people were inclined and tilted toward fascism. And today we study this fascism in international relations. So students, this event, once again, the Great Depression of 1929, this event, another event that led to the expansion of a scope of IR in 20th century. Socialism and fascism did not exist before this. It was born, these two approaches were born as a result of Great Depression of 1929, and the Great Depression contributed in the evolution of a scope of IR. We study this today in this century. So we have studied three events here: birth of idealism, then birth of international organization, and then Great Depression of 1929. And we are studying that how different events of history are contributing in the expansion and evolution of a scope of IR in 20th century. And I hope that all this is making sense. Then students, in 1939, World War II started. World War II started and it expanded the scope of IR. Today we study World War II in the scope of IR. Students, this World War II denounced idealism. We all know that idealism was introduced by Woodrow Wilson after the end of World War I, and the main aim of idealism was the prevention of war in the world and promotion of peace among nations in the world. But it failed at doing so. It could not prevent war in the world. World War II started in 1939. It could not prevent the initiation of World War II in the world. So it failed. Moreover, League of Nations also failed. And we saw a resurgence of realism in the world after the initiation of World War II. Then a great debate started. Debate between realism and idealism, and we call this debate the First Great Debate. E. H. Carr, who was a realist scholar, he wrote a book, The 20-Year Crisis, and in this book he denounced idealism and he promoted realism. So students, the first great debate, that is the great debate between realism and idealism, we study this debate in IR today. So we know that how this World War II contributed in the evolution of the scope of IR. Then student, in 1945, World War II ended, and it was the beginning of a new era. How? Nuclear weapons were invented and used to end World War II. We all know that USA developed nuclear weapons in 1945, and it used these nuclear weapons, it used atom bomb to end World War II. So nuclear weapon is one of the main areas of IR. We study this today. So did you people notice that how the end of World War II contributed in the evolution of a scope of IR? It added another area in IR, in the scope of IR, that is nuclear weapons. And a new era was started after the end of World War II. Then student, a new global order was set in the world after World War II. We saw a revival of international organizations. United Nations was formed by the global leaders, and a right of self-determination was given to different nations in the world. There was a wave of decolonization in the world. Different countries were decolonized, and United Nations was determined to decolonize all the colonized nations of the world. Pakistan, Indian nation was decolonized, many African nations were decolonized, many Asian nations were decolonized, and there was a wave of decolonization. So today we study this decolonization also in the scope of IR. And United Nations, we study United Nations, which is an international organization. This is also the scope of IR, and we study this in the scope of IR. Then student, a new global order was set. That is bipolar order of the world. Two superpowers emerged at the map of the world. One was USA and the other was USSR. So we study this bipolar order of the world and the balance of power among these two superpowers of the world. We study all this in IR today. So here we can notice that how these different events are contributing in the expansion and the evolution of a scope of IR. Then student, in 1948 a global issue was started, that is Israel-Palestine conflict. The mandate of Jews was given to British. Jews moved to Palestine and they settled there, they made their own government there. And today it is a global issue and it is unresolved till date. This issue is also discussed, and it is also, we can say that this issue is also covered in the scope of IR, and it also contributed in the expansion and evolution of a scope of IR. So students, after the end of World War II, almost all nations of the world, global leaders and international organizations shifted their concentration from military development, war and conflict to economic development and the prevalence of peace in the world. International organizations started giving aid to the underdeveloped countries of the world, and these organizations started giving the right of self-determination to the different nations of the world, and we saw a wave of decolonization in the world, and different nations started securing their separate states in the world, for example India and Pakistan. So this is what international organizations and global leaders started doing after the end of World War II. Another mission that was started by the international organizations and global leaders was the mission of disarmament. Students, global leaders, and international organizations started exacting promises from the different nations of the world that these nations would disarm themselves and they would not resort to wars in the world again. But why international organizations started this mission? Why international organizations emphasized on disarmament? Because students, the world had already witnessed the horrific consequences of nuclear attacks in World War II. We all know that USA attacked Japan by nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. USA threw two atomic bombs on Japan. And students, after these attacks, the entire world, the whole globe realized that these nuclear weapons possess the ability to put an end to human life in the world. It can exterminate human life in the world. This is the reason that international organizations started the mission of disarmament, and nuclear non-proliferation treaty was started and signed in 1968. Well, there are some countries in the world that still have not signed this treaty, and Pakistan is also one of those countries. Then student, Cold War started in 1950. This Cold War contributed in the expansion of a scope of IR in 20th century. US and USSR started a new kind of war. It was an unprecedented war, and it was the war of ideology. USSR was communist at the time, and USA was capitalist at that time. USA was the advocate and supporter of democracy, but USSR did not like democracy. It was a proponent of communism at the time, and the world saw a new kind of war. It was an unprecedented war, and this war contributed in the expansion and evolution of a scope of IR in 20th century. Today, we study this war in the scope of international relations. Then students, USA and USSR fought proxy wars in Afghanistan, Korea, and Vietnam. Students, this kind of war, proxy war, was also an addition to the scope of IR. Before this, there were no proxy wars in the world. But after the beginning of Cold War in 1950, these two superpowers started fighting proxy wars in Afghanistan and Korea and Vietnam. And today we study these kind of wars also. Then students, the two nations started race in space also. They started sending different projects and satellites in space, and USA landed on moon also, and a race in space was also started, and we study all this in IR. So yes, we can say that Cold War was an event that contributed in the expansion of the scope of IR. Then student, after this Cold War, we saw an evolution in theories and approaches of IR. New realism was introduced by Kenneth Waltz in 1979. Then to counter this new realism, the scholars of liberalism gave another theory, that is new liberalism. And it was the evolution of theories and approaches, and we study this today. And this evolution of theories and approaches contributed in the expansion of the scope of IR in 20th century. I hope that all this is making sense, and we can understand that how different events in the history of the world are contributing in the expansion of the scope of IR in 20th century. Then student, in 1989, Cold War ended and we saw a new global order, and we saw unipolar order of the world. USA became the sole superpower of the world. Then students, the scholars of liberalism celebrated this event, and they said that they claimed that now there is no threat of security in the world. We have a single superpower in the world. We have a unipolar order of the world, and the concept of security is obsolete now. But then student, another area was added to the scope of IR. Barry-Buzan gave a new concept of security, that is a non-traditional concept of security. Barry-Buzan said that no, the concept of security is not obsolete, but it is widened now. Till today, we used to study the traditional concept of security. From now onwards, we would study a new non-traditional concept of security. We would study societal threat, we would study economic threat, and we would study environmental threats. And these threats would contribute in the expansion of the concept of security. So today, students, we study traditional concept of security as well as non-traditional concept of security. Students, this event of the history, the end of Cold War and the introduction of non-traditional concept of security, it shows that how this event contributed in the expansion of the scope of IR in 20th century. So I hope that all of this is making sense, and all of you can understand that how the different events are contributing in the expansion of the scope of IR, and how the scope of IR is evolving with each passing day and with each passing event of the history. Then students, in 2001, another event took place that expanded the scope of IR even further. It was the beginning of terrorism in 2001. Al-Qaeda attacked on two important buildings of USA. Al-Qaeda attacked World Trade Center and Pentagon of USA, and it led to start of war on terror by Bush administration. Bush administration started war on terror, global war on terror. US and NATO forces invaded Afghanistan in 2001, and America fought its longest and most costly war in Afghanistan. Pakistan was also dragged into this war. And students, this event, the beginning of terrorism in 2001, added another area in IR that we study today. We study terrorism in detail today in the scope of IR. So we can say that yes, this event contributed in the expansion of the scope of IR. Students, before this, there were no terrorist organizations. I mean, yes, terrorist organizations existed, but they were not significant. After this, terrorist organizations were added in the study of IR, and they were considered as a significant global actor, and we started studying the different terrorist organizations in the scope of IR. We started studying Al-Qaeda, we started studying ISKP, Daesh, and Boko Haram. We started studying all these terrorist organizations. Terrorist organizations are today very significant non-state actors, and we study this today. So we can say that yes, in 21st century, the beginning of terrorism was an event that contributed in the expansion of scope of IR. Then student, the Arab Springs of 2010, it was a series of anti-government protests by youngsters of Arab countries. It was against the authoritarianism, poverty and corruption, and this is an event that is studied in IR today, and we study this event, we analyze this event. This was against the authoritarianism and the corruption, and it also expanded the scope of IR in 21st century. Then student, the most important development and the most important event of history, rise of China in the early years of 21st century. Students, after the start of 21st century, Chinese economy grew rapidly. It is the most significant development of the 21st century. We all know that after the rise of China, USA is perturbed. This rise of China is inculcating a fear in USA that in the future China would replace USA as the superpower of the world, and China would take the position of superpower of the world. So this is a very interesting and the most significant development of the 21st century, and we study this in the scope of IR. So we can say that yes, this change of global order is contributing in the expansion of a scope of IR in 21st century. Okay students, so the most important and hot topic for the scholars of IR in this century is the US-China war. We all know that China is growing diplomatically and economically also, and China is challenging the world order. It is replacing USA as the superpower of the world. And the rise of China is inculcating fear in the leaders of USA. So there is a conflict and competition between China and USA, and this conflict and competition is inevitable because there is a change of global order. USA, that is a status quo, it is fearing that China in the future would replace USA as the world order. So there is a conflict between these two countries, and this is the most important topic for the scholars of IR in this century. So we can say that yes, this US-China war is contributing in the evolution of a scope of IR in 21st century. Then student, a new concept that the scholars of IR are studying today is the new colonization. Students, this term is coined by the leaders of USA. The leaders of USA accused China of practicing this new colonization. Students, we all know that China has started a multi-billion-dollar project, that is BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. China is trying to connect almost all the countries of South Asia and Central Asia. China is trying to connect different nations through railways and roads and sea routes also. So students, USA accuses China of new colonization. USA is saying that China is investing in different countries just for its own advantage, and China in future would control these countries, and China would extend its power beyond its borders economically. And this is the concept of new colonization. USA has given a new term, new colonization, and USA is saying that China is practicing new colonization. China would colonize these countries in which it is investing. China would colonize these countries economically, and for this they have used the term new colonization. But this is a new concept that the scholars of IR study, and we can say that yes, this concept is added in the scope of IR in 21st century, and it has contributed in the evolution and expansion of scope of IR in 21st century, imperialism and new colonization. So students, I hope that all of this is clear now. we have studied this evolution of a scope of IR in 20th century as well as in 21st century, and we have studied this in historical context. We studied that how different historical events contributed in the expansion of a scope of IR. We studied the idealism, we studied international organization and the beginning, the start of non-state actors. Then we studied Cold War. Cold War also expanded the scope of IR. Then we studied new realism. Then we studied the introduction of non-traditional concept of security. Then we studied the disarmament, and we studied terrorism, US-China war, rise of China, everything. And student, now we can, I hope that all of you can analyze now that how all these events led to the expansion of a scope of IR in 20th century and 21st century also. And student, it shows, all this study shows that IR is a kind of subject whose nature is ever evolving and ever expanding, because different events would take place in future also. We all know that the world is changing on hour to hour, day to day, and year to year basis, and the changing nature of the world would keep on changing and evolving the scope of IR also. In the first lecture, I gave a very simple definition of IR, that is, IR is the study of world in transition. We all know that world is in transition. Each and every day different events occur, different agreements take place among different nations of the world. So yes, we can say that the scope of IR is evolving. The scope of IR is expanding with each passing day, and we studied this in the historical context, and I hope that it is clear now. Okay students, we have studied that the nature of scope of IR is evolving. IR is evolving with each passing day. Now we're going to study that how and why international relations is a significant subject. What is the significance of IR? First of all, students, we all know that IR was born out of ashes of war. So IR is significant because its main aim is to avoid world wars. It investigates the reasons of world wars. It provides ways to prevent world wars. Then IR provide different approaches to maintain and promote peace in the world. This is the reason that this is significant. It advocates the liberal approach. It gives different approaches to peace. It forms different international organizations. These international organizations work for the prevalence of peace in the world. Then in IR we study international law also. International law also advocates the prevalence of peace in the world, and it provides different ways to promote peace in the world. So this is another aim of IR, and it proves that IR is significant. Then students, IR promotes cooperation among nations of the world. How it promotes cooperation among nations in the world? Through international organizations and through international law. Then students, IR educate people. IR is oriented around the education and research of different world issues. IR educate people about different world issues. IR gives different ways to resolve these issues and to prevent the wars and to promote peace among the different nations of the world, and it educates people also about these different issues. Scholars of IR also research for new ways of promoting peace. So all these things show that yes, IR is a significant subject in the world, and it has its value also, because its aim is very very important in today's world. We all know that its main aim is to avoid world wars and to promote peace in the world. Scholars of the IR study different theories, they study the different developments, and they analyze these developments, and they forecast that what would happen in the future and how these developments would impact and what would be the implications of these developments. This is all about IR, and scholars of IR study all this. So students, today we have studied the evolving nature and the evolving scope of IR. We have studied that how this scope of IR evolved with the passage of time in 20th century and 21st century. Then we studied the significance of international relations as a subject. Students, I hope that I have made myself clear, and whatever we studied today is clear. This is the end of this lecture, student. In the next lecture, we would study nation-state systems of the world. Till then, students, thank you. Allah Hafiz. Stay focused on your goals, stay focused on the studies, and don't forget to subscribe the channel Knowledge Realm. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.